when my sister kicked my 8-month pregnant belly and screamed, "This is my day," the entire wedding venue went silent. My gown was torn, I was bleeding on the marble floor, and my own family stood there recording it on their phones instead of calling an ambulance. My sister thought she had permanently stolen my spotlight, my happiness, and my future. She smiled as the paramedics wheeled me away, convinced she'd gotten away with the ultimate act of cruelty. But what my sister didn't realize was that 9 months later, the exact venue where she tried to ruin my life would become the stage for her total public undoing. I'm leaving the rest of this story for you to judge. Comment the city or state you're watching from so I can see how far our tale has traveled today. Welcome back to BT Revenge Tales. My name is Clara, I'm 29 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my primary role in our family was simply to exist in my younger sister Chloe's shadow. Chloe was 26, spoiled rotten, and treated like an untouchable princess by our parents. If Chloe wanted something, the entire household stopped until she got it, while I was always expected to be the quiet, self-sacrificing older sister who quietly surrendered her own needs to keep the peace. When I married my husband, David, it was the first time in my life I felt genuinely prioritized and loved. But the ultimate turning point came when I found out I was expecting our first child, a high-risk pregnancy that required constant medical care. Instead of being happy for me, Chloe was furious. She saw my growing belly as a direct threat to her spotlight, especially because she was planning her own grand, over-the-top wedding. To Chloe, my pregnancy wasn't a blessing, it was an unforgivable crime for stealing her attention. The day of Chloe's lavish wedding arrived, and despite being 8 months pregnant and exhausted from doctor visits, I showed up to support her. I wore a simple dress, kept a low profile, and spent most of the afternoon helping behind the scenes, making sure everything ran smoothly. I did everything possible to stay out of the spotlight, so Chloe could have her perfect day. During the reception, as guests milled around the grand ballroom, an older family friend walked over to me, smiling softly and complimented how glowing and radiant I looked in my pregnancy. It was a harmless, innocent comment, but Chloe happened to be walking past. In an instant, her face twisted with pure rage. Before anyone could react, she lunged across the floor, screaming at the top of her lungs, "This is my day." She shoved me violently to the ground, torn fabric ripping, and kicked my heavy, pregnant belly with all her strength. Pain exploded through my body as I hit the cold marble floor, clutching my stomach in horror. Blood began to stain my dress. But what shattered me wasn't just the physical blow, it was watching my parents freeze, pull out their phones, and stand there recording the scene instead of calling for help. The blare of sirens was a terrifying blur as the ambulance rushed me to the emergency room, my heart hammering against my ribs in absolute terror for my baby's life. David arrived at the hospital pale and frantic, taking my hand and refusing to let go as doctors rushed me into surgery for an emergency delivery. Miraculously, after hours of agonizing fear, our tiny baby girl came into the world crying, frighteningly small, but alive and healthy. As I lay in the recovery room holding my daughter, the door swung open. It wasn't to offer comfort. My parents walked in, looking tense and annoyed rather than relieved. Instead of asking how their newborn granddaughter was doing, my mother leaned over my bed and demanded that I decline to press criminal charges against Chloe. She insisted that arresting my sister would cause a public scandal and ruin Chloe's new marriage. Looking into my parents' cold, unbothered eyes, something inside me finally snapped. I didn't yell or cry. I simply nodded, softly agreeing to drop the issue so they would believe I had surrendered. But as they walked out of the room satisfied, I looked at my baby girl and made a silent vow. They thought I was backing down, but I was actually preparing a quiet, devastating storm. Over the next 9 months, I cut off all emotional ties with my family while maintaining a polite, distant facade. They assumed I had quietly fallen back into my role as the passive older sister, but behind closed doors, David and I were putting together the pieces of a massive financial puzzle. My parents had always managed a family inheritance trust intended for both Chloe and me, but when David and I hired a forensic accountant, we uncovered something far worse than family bias. Chloe and her new husband had taken out massive, fraudulent business loans using my name, my credit, and my half of the trust as unauthorized collateral to fund their lavish lifestyle, their wedding, and their new venture. They believed I was too distracted by motherhood to ever check the bank statements or look at my credit reports. Instead of going to the police immediately, I worked closely with my attorney to gather every bank record, forged signature, and piece of security footage from the wedding venue. We built an airtight case, quietly securing legal holds on every single one of their assets without dropping a single hint to my family. 9 months after the attack, Chloe and my parents hosted a grand one-year anniversary and business launch party at the exact same high-end venue where she had kicked my pregnant belly. They invited wealthy investors, local media, and our entire extended social circle to celebrate their new corporate venture. They truly believed they were completely invincible. When David and I walked into the ballroom, dressed in sharp, elegant attire, the entire room went silent. Chloe strutted over, holding a glass of champagne, a smirk playing on her lips. She assumed I was there to beg for her forgiveness and plead for family unity in front of her high society guests. She leaned in close and whispered, "Look at you, still crawling back for my scraps." I didn't blink. I didn't get angry. I simply smiled back, took a sip of my sparkling water, and looked at my watch. The clock was ticking down to 8 o'clock, the exact time my attorney had scheduled our legal filings to go live. Chloe turned back to the crowd, completely unaware that her glorious moment was about to turn into a complete nightmare. As Chloe took the stage to present her business plan to the room of wealthy investors, the large projector screen behind her flickered. But instead of her corporate presentation, the high-definition security footage from 9 months prior played across the giant screen. The room gasped in horror as the video clearly showed Chloe lunging across the ballroom, screaming "This is my day," and brutally kicking my heavily pregnant stomach while I bled on the floor. Before Chloe could process the horror unfolding, the screen shifted to a detailed audit showing her forged signatures, bank fraud, and the stolen trust funds. Panic shouts echoed through the venue as investors immediately stood up and walked out, canceling their funding on the spot. Seconds later, the heavy double doors opened, and 2 process servers accompanied by law enforcement officers stepped into the room. They handed Chloe and her husband federal subpoenas for financial fraud, while my parents watched their carefully built reputation collapse into absolute ruin. Chloe stood frozen on stage, hyperventilating as the police escorted her out for questioning. As she passed me, she looked into my eyes, begging for help. I simply took David's hand, turned my back on her, and walked out into the cool evening air. 6 months later, the dust has finally settled. Chloe faced severe probation, heavy financial restitution, and the complete collapse of her fraudulent business, while my parents were forced to sell their home to cover her legal fees. They lost everything they fought so hard to protect. Meanwhile, David and I bought a beautiful home in a peaceful neighborhood where our healthy, happy 9-month-old daughter takes her first steps. Stepping away from that toxic environment was the greatest gift I could have ever given my true family. Justice isn't always quick, but when it arrives, it settles every score completely. Now, I want to hear from you. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have forgiven them, or taken the same path to justice? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the videos on your screen to watch more stories on BT Revenge Tales. Thank you for watching until the end.